In this episode of New Frontiers, we have syndicated columnist Rob Robb, as well as a history professor, Henry Thompson, who talk about a wide variety of issues, all under the umbrella of what's happening in the presidential campaign. Now, we start the discussion with a deep discussion about what happened in the state of the state. What actually was taking place? What was Joe Biden saying, and who was he playing to? How was he trying to deal with the Ukraine issue, the Israel issue, his fairness doctrine that he's talking about, as well as other unintended consequences, such as the issues of a balanced budget. In the end of this, we also come to a discussion talking about DEI as well as post-colonialism. And finally, we get to Donald Trump and talking about his campaign as well. It's a great analysis by a group of people that I think you'll enjoy. Thanks for being with us here on the New Frontiers. Now, if you're ready to get started, just go ahead and press that subscribe button. We'll get going. Again, this is Paul Johnson, just a regular old optimistic American who still believes that the United States is a cause for good. Thanks for being here.
Destiny. Destiny. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. 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 You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Well, I'd like to welcome both of our guests to the New Frontiers. Bob Robb, we appreciate you being here. I always appreciate your column on are they on a weekly basis now?
At least weekly.
Occasionally
I'll throw in an extra one.
Yeah, and those are always fun to read. Also, Professor Thompson, how's it going out at ASU, Henry?
Things are good. Great to see you, Paul. And Bob, I actually listened to your podcast that you sent out earlier this week.
The one with your son?
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
Thank you.
Tell us about the podcast a little bit, Bob.
My son's a high school social studies teacher, and we do an occasional podcast, nowhere near as rigorous or as often as you do, on politics and public policy. We call it an intergenerational exchange of ideas and views. And so it's been a fun thing to do with my son.
Yeah, that does sound like fun. I'm pretty sure if I put my sons on here, I'd end up losing the fight. So, they're getting better at that. All right, so here's what we want to cover today. We want to talk about the presidential election. Last week was an important week in the presidential election, maybe the kickoff. We're 9 months before the campaign itself, or before the general election date itself. The actual conventions don't happen until somewhere in August. But the president did a State of the Union address. And that State of the Union address, usually it covers issues that are more about the union. This time it seemed to cover more about politics and the race. And to me, it was almost a starting gun for the race itself. So we're going to diagnose that State of the Union as part of the political campaign. I'm going to start with you, Bob. I know you're writing a column about that this week. So tell us kind of what your thoughts are, maybe in the beginning from a 30,000 point view.
I think it was not almost a starting gun. I think it was explicitly a starting gun, and intentionally so. And I think it reflected a strategic decision by the Biden campaign, and in my judgment, a strategic mistake. The speech, which began with a call to defend democracy, which can unite the Democrats and the center and center-right Republicans and independents who were alarmed and dismayed by Trump's attempted coup. But then it went very quickly to a call for a massive expansion of the role and scope of the federal government in a whole variety of areas and arenas. So to me, it was mostly an attempt to politically to rekindle enthusiasm in the Democratic base, which is a political problem for Biden, but also sort of assuming that the center and center-right disaffected Republicans and independents that in my judgment, decide the election will swallow whatever aggressive, progressive Democratic agenda is offered simply out of unwillingness to give Trump a second term. We'll probably get into the politics, but given that there will be independent candidacies on the left, I think that's a dangerous assumption to make going in, and that if Biden was serious about believing that democracy is on the ballot, he would be pursuing far more of a consensus agenda rather than a hard left agenda.
Yeah, I had kind of two views of it. My first view of it was one from my own personal taste, and when I get down into the weeds, it didn't represent almost anything of what I believed in. I say that I definitely liked what he had to say about foreign policy. I did like what he had to say about Ukraine. That certainly was important. I thought his conversation on the immigration bill was good, but most of the things that dealt with how he saw his government being a solution to almost every single problem was problematic for me. On the other hand, politically, I thought it was a very good speech politically, but that's because I identify the problem for Biden as all of the above. He has a problem with his base. He has a problem with people in the center. He has a problem with people in let's call it the Nikki Haley right. And he has, and that challenge comes from a lack of energy, a lack of an ability to show that he has the wherewithal to be able to be successful.
I thought this State of the Union was an attempt at damage control by President Biden, to be frank. In the lead up to the speech, he'd been plagued by a few really bad opinion polls that had come out in the early days of the week before the address, I think on Thursday night. And before that, even, the debate around Biden had really been about his age. We've seen a flurry of commentary, even in the New York Times, the Atlantic, New York Magazine, places that are very sympathetic to Biden about his age and potential inability to complete a second term. And then also among certain parts of his constituency, especially in inner Minneapolis, where there's a lot of Somali and Muslim voters, and also in Michigan, where there are a lot of Muslim voters, a lot of hostility about the ongoing war in Gaza. So I interpreted what you both saw as this really political, left-wing populist speech as an attempt by Biden to shore up that base to sort of stop the political bleeding before the campaign got going.
So I saw success in the speech, but I'm open to interpretation on this. So first, he had energy. Maybe a little bit. I mean, I kept wondering if he was on crack cocaine for parts of it. I mean, he definitely had more energy than actually, if he was my candidate, I might give him some. But nonetheless, but the point is he had this. He had that step back that a politician needs. So I thought that was important. I think he overcame the age issue to a degree on that, just to show that that this isn't a guy who is out of it and that is in. And they can't respond. In fact, I think the Republicans played into his hand on that. I say the Republicans, Green played into his hand on that. I'm pretty sure Mike Johnson would have preferred she not do what she had done. But by her making the attack against him and him being able to respond back, anyone can watch a speech and recognize there's a teleprompter there, and the teleprompter is giving them what to say. The question becomes, how do you deal with something on an impromptu basis, and did he have the wherewithal, the cognitive ability to do that? She gave him that opening, and he took it. And that, while I wouldn't have called it great, it certainly put him in play. It made him look like he was able to respond to something. So I thought that was helpful to him. With his base, it's clear to me in watching it, the Democratic base was fired up over the speech. I don't know that they're fired up over the candidacy yet, but they were fired up over the speech. I think he was at the point with his Democratic base that he had so many problems with them that I didn't see the race as being winnable from his standpoint. I thought he was in huge trouble with the left and with the center and with the Nikki Haley right. The question becomes, when you try to triangulate those things, as Bill Clinton used to call it, when you try to bring in the Nikki Haley right by talking about national security and foreign policy, you talk about the immigration issue and how you're willing to do something, and then you begin to carve out what I suspect was his view of fairness, meaning the only reason we can't have these programs is because the rich people are somehow or another doing harm to us. They're not paying their fair share. I think those messages are so diametrically opposed that when you get into the weeds, I think you begin to lose the people that you were trying to attract in the center and on the far right.
Again, I think that there's been a strategic calculation made that it's enough for those swing voters to not be Trump. That Trump is bad enough and enough of a threat that he doesn't need to tailor what he advocates programmatically to be palatable to those swing voters. He can go hard left to try to rekindle enthusiasm among his base. And those people in the final analysis will reject a second term for Trump because of his unique threat to our constitutional order. He is asking those swing voters to swallow an awful lot. He could triangulate in 2020, and he did run a bifurcated campaign. He developed a unity platform with Bernie Sanders, which was hard left. But on the campaign trail, he was saying, hey, I'm the Joe Biden you've always known. I'm a moderate Democrat. I'm a return to the status quo ante after all this chaos that you've endured. He can no longer do that because he attempted to govern on the unity Sanders-Biden agenda. And at the State of the Union, he laid out a continuation and expansion of that. So for those swing voters, the difficult question that's going to be presented them, if they accept that Trump is a unique threat to the constitutional order, and I think what he did after the 2020 election establishes that, how far can we go down the Biden, Sanders, Elizabeth Warren direction before it is too costly and too difficult to come back? Mm-hmm. Can we survive 4 more years of that? And there's lots of complicated calculations that go into that. Obviously, if Republicans take over the Senate, as is generally thought to be the most likely outcome, all that stuff doesn't get passed. If the Democrats maintain the filibuster, all that in control of the Senate, but maintain the filibuster, all of that doesn't get passed. But given you've got the retirement of Sinema and Manchin, the two leading Democratic defenders of the filibuster, who won't be there. So if you got a clean sweep of the Democrats for that swing voter, you have a real threat that all of that's going to be enacted. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, do you bet on surviving 4 more years of Trump, counting on his incompetence? Or do you deal with that threat by voting for Biden and run the risk that you get too far down this track that you think fundamentally changes what this country stands for?
Mm-hmm. You know, it's for me, and I think for many Americans, when you watch the speech and you hear the railing against people who have wealth, the first thing that it does is it's a way to create a greater social divide in the country. And it's not lost on me that's what Trump does. Trump continually tries to divide up the United States, to create the people who are anti-immigrant and the people who are pro-immigrant, or the people who believe that we should have a government that creates a stronger role for the president, which some people call an authoritarian, and those people who don't. But there's a constant division, a wedge that's being pushed. What I saw in the speech was that wedge being pushed from the left. Now, the challenge becomes, at least when I look at it, is you have one guy who obviously would like to kind of clean out your pockets. Given his way, he'd like to make certain that anybody who was making As he said, over $400,000 was paying their fair share, but he was using numbers that weren't fair. As an example, if you say, well, corporations only pay about 8% in income. Okay, well, should you be paying tax on income that you earn that you haven't yet realized? If you've invested money in the stock market and you invested it 30 years ago and it was worth $10,000 when you invested it, today it's worth $100,000, should you pay tax on $90,000? Right? The answer to that has been no. And so depending upon how you look at those numbers is the way that you begin to skew whether or not somebody's paying their fair share. The reverse of it for me is, while I'm worried about him doing that, I'm probably more worried about somebody trying to diminish the value of my vote, diminish the value of my ability to be able to participate through a free election. My thinking becomes, look, I have, as long as I can vote, I can keep countering the guy who's trying to get into my pocket. But if you end up taking away, either taking away or greatly diminishing the power that we have as a voter, I end up losing both. They both become problematic.
And I think that's precisely the bet that the Biden campaign has decided to make, that Trump is so unique a threat to the constitutional order that swing voters who may not like the hard left agenda that he's running on, but which excites his base, or at least has the possibility of healing breaches with his base, that those people will be there in the end. Given the fact that there will be independent liberal candidates, the Green Party candidate will be on the ballot. Who knows whether Professor West will make it on the ballot? Who knows how many states Robert F. Kennedy Jr. will be on the ballot, and whether he will be perceived as the ardent environmentalist that he's been, or the anti-vaxxer that he has also been, and who he takes the most from. I think it is a big risk by the Biden campaign to simply say, on policy, we're going to ignore what those center-right swing voters who can't stomach Trump are willing to accept.
And my guess is, and Henry, I'd love to hear your view of this, but my guess is he's also creating, I'm looking for a center-right person on economics to run. Now, maybe that doesn't happen. Maybe that candidate doesn't exist. Maybe the No Labels Party doesn't put someone forward. But I think the opening that he's creating is for a candidate who actually will come in and carve that out. I'm not certain about this, but my guess is Biden, Kennedy, and that third-party candidate probably is better for Trump.
Yeah, my question, I guess, for Bob is this a strategic choice, or is this a defensive strategy by Biden and his campaign in order to shore up the base on the far left before they are able to do anything else? I think that economic policy platform that's basically an extension or a doubling down on the sort of big government plans that the Biden administration has implemented since the pandemic, it's not really an appeal to the middle. I agree with you. And in fact, most Americans, despite the relatively good economic numbers, are quite disillusioned with Joe Biden's economic policy record. So to me, this suggests that, in fact, what they're doing is reacting to events and to a weakness on the left, among the voters that they absolutely need to turn out to have any chance of winning this election. And they have to do that, and they had to do that last week before they can do anything else.
It used to be that a politician could run to the left in the primary or in the early part of a campaign and then return to the center in the general election. I don't think that's possible anymore because everything's recorded, everything can be played back. So they may have decided in terms of prioritization, they first of all needed to shore up things on the left. But I think that precludes them from doing what they did in 2020 and bifurcating their message, running on the Sanders-Biden unity platform on the left, running on the I'm your Uncle Joe, I'm the guy from Scranton, Pennsylvania, who rides Amtrak, and I'm your safe Democratic alternative that isn't really going to change things up a whole lot. So I'm a safe vote if you don't like Trump. Having enunciated the successor to the Sanders-Biden unity platform in a State of the Union address, I don't know how you then turn to swing voters that don't want to see higher taxes, don't want to see a massive expansion in government, and say, oh, I'm safe. You can vote for me. Don't worry about policy. Stop Trump again. I just think it may be born out of perceived necessity, but I don't think there's a two-step strategy that you can pursue.
To do the pivot.
I think pursuing A precludes this time around pursuing B.
All right, so let's pull these policies apart a little bit, just to hear what type of success you think that he may have had on any given issue. So on Ukraine, he clearly was trying to point out that there were a group of people in the Republican Party that was stopping them from being able to allow that issue to come forward. There's now a lot of talk amongst Democrats and Republicans about putting something on the agenda that goes around the speaker. That seemed to come from the speech itself. It seems like there are a group of people looking to do that. But was he successful at highlighting that issue and highlighting the importance of getting that out of Congress, or was it just lost in the rest of the shuffle?
I don't think Biden has done a good job of explaining to the American people what the U.S. stake is in Ukraine at a minimum, holding Russia and Putin at bay. And he just skimmed the surface on providing a justification for that. And he said the key is to provide Ukraine the weapons it needs to win. His administration has not done that. They have been slow to provide weapons with the sufficient lethality that the Ukrainians needed at the time. He's always been a little late on that. And European countries have had to step up into the breach periodically. So I think he's right, and I'm hopeful that there will be some kind of bipartisan effort in the House to force this issue so that we can provide Ukraine at least the weapons that we're willing to provide them within the constraints that the Biden administration has established on what they're capable of doing. But I don't think he turned that issue to his political advantage in that particular speech. I don't think that he persuaded anybody.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. And I thought that was a great opportunity. Not that he hadn't already gone on long enough, but maybe it would have been better to have cut out some from the fairness doctrine and focused more on why international policies can and is having an effect on average Americans, and why it is that if we're not involved in this one here, sooner or later this is going to come to our shore. It's going to be something that we're going to have to deal with, as history's proved out over and over again.
Neither the United States, nor Europe, nor even the Ukraine have a theory of victory in the Ukraine war at the moment that is feasible and realistic. And so what's happened in the United States is that this has come down to a very, very superficial trading of strategic arguments in Congress, and with Biden trying to point the finger at the Republicans for not approving more funding for Ukraine, when in fact the problem is much more fundamental, that the Ukrainians themselves don't even know how they could win this war and can't even pass a law reducing the conscription age to 27 to get enough manpower into the battlefield. So I think that the Ukraine situation is essentially hopeless at this point. It's unfortunate and sad. And I'm not entirely sure how this is going to play itself out over the next 6 to 12 months. And I'm not sure how much of an influence the United States can even have on what's going to happen in eastern Ukraine over the coming months.
I would agree with Henry that nobody has a strategy for evicting Russia from those parts of Ukraine which it has already seized. But I do believe that it is possible to continue to keep Putin from succeeding in expanding the territory of Ukraine, which he controls, and taking over the whole country and turning it into a protectorate run and managed by Russia. Arguing that you should invest heavily in essence, stalemate is a very difficult political sell. But I do believe it is greatly in the U.S. strategic interest to ensure that it doesn't go beyond a stalemate. And I think the Ukrainians have proved their willingness to fight and their ability to fight. And with sufficient support from the United States and Europe, it can succeed in at least maintaining the stalemate, which is not a optimistic outcome for the Ukrainians and may ultimately result in a painful secession agreement. But it is still well worth the investment that we're being asked to make in containing what Russia achieves in Ukraine, and thereby substantially deterring Russian actions elsewhere in the region.
You know, I think it's fair to say that our military budget today, which is at about $800 billion plus annually, that about 20 to 25% of it is really designed around trying to contain Vladimir Putin. And there's a very good argument that says we've been very successful with that portion of this budget doing exactly that. You know, you have to look at this and say, hey, let's go back to the beginning and let's figure out who has won and who has lost. I can't see any other way to define this other than Russia has suffered a huge loss. They clearly would have been better off not to have done this. Clearly, right? They wouldn't have Sweden and Finland in NATO. They wouldn't have lost the amount of young men and maybe young women that they put into this war effort. They wouldn't have been embarrassed nationally. NATO they haven't been as united as at least since the Soviet Union and maybe all the way back to World War II. The unity that is there is stronger than I've ever seen it. You have the French, misguidedly, I believe, talking about sending troops in and whether or not troops should be in Ukraine. In the struggle between the United States and Russia, I think the United States has come out overwhelmingly on the top of this one. This is a bigger mistake for him than Vietnam ever was for the United States 40, 50 years ago. It's a massive mistake. The real question is Ukraine. And in the end, I think we care about them. But if you just look at this from the strategic issue of where the U.S. and Russia is, I think we're a winner. I do agree with you. We're better off, the U.S. from the U.S.'s standpoint, that this is a stalemate than losing Kiev to Russia. I clearly think that's true. From the United States standpoint, putting funding into this, it makes eminent sense for us to continue to push Russia back. I don't worry about the Mike Johnsons of the world. I really believe Mike Johnson, he's a conservative. I may have disagreements with him on a number of different issues, but on this issue, I would guess he is every bit as pro-Ukrainian and pro-US as I am. The problem is that they've created a structure internally inside their caucus that says they're going to let 5 people determine what everybody else is going to do. And I think that's problematic for...
And one very big guy on the outside.
And one very big guy on the outside. And that to me is challenging. Now, the guy on the outside, all he does is prove to me over and again that the only thing he cares about is power. That's it. He doesn't really care about the interest of the U.S. Now, I know there are isolationists who are thinking he's doing their bidding. But I will almost bet anything, if he does get back in, no one knows what action he's going to take, because he doesn't know what action he's going to take. He's going to take whatever he thinks serves him best. That's exactly what he's going to do. But allowing that small group of people to control what is the best policy for the United States, now that's a loser for us. That's something that embarrasses us to our allies, that embarrasses us to the people who we're going to need long term. And I think that, it's probably true that if Mike Johnson puts this on the floor, he's probably going to lose his position. But the answer is, lose it. What's the value to holding on to it?
Well, so far, he's passed 2 continuing resolutions and a final budget bill doing precisely what Kevin McCarthy did that got him ousted. And so far, that Freedom Caucus crowd has not threatened his speakership, or at least not taken action. They're full of threats, but they haven't taken any action. So I don't know that bringing a national security bill that would include funding for Ukraine would be enough to trigger that if what he's been doing on the bigger budget questions hasn't triggered it yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. By the way, if there's any area that I could agree with the far right on, it's we shouldn't be continuing to run the country by continuing resolutions. I really do think that it's highly problematic that we're not going through the normal order, that we're not going through the budgetary process. And candidly, I think that the deficits that we have are too big. Now, I would bet anything. I don't know. I wouldn't bet that Joe Biden couldn't get his social programs passed. That would not surprise me to see that he could get it passed. But it would surprise me to see that he got the tax to go along with passing, which just means we're going to continue to add to the deficit. I do think that there is, at some point, that in itself becomes problematic. And I've always appreciated even the Tea Party group that was on the other side that was willing to pull this country back and say, hey, don't go too far. Don't spend too much. I think there's a logic to us doing that.
I'm interested in hearing Bob's thoughts on this as well. I mean, the US federal government seems to behave in a way as if there is essentially no budget constraint. And the only people who are interested in fiscal restraint seem to have either been forced out of Congress, right? Some of the leading figures who are trying to push for more restraint have been forced out of Congress, or they are regarded as sort of kooks in a way. But at what stage does the deficit become a real factor in federal politics, Bob? If the interest payments get to a certain level, that the government's ability to maneuver in other fields becomes constrained, or can we continue to kick this can down the road indefinitely?
I think if there were a Paul Ryan in Congress at present, that the moment is before us. The increase in interest rates that the federal government is having to pay, I think has enough consequence, both in terms of the deficit, arguably in terms of the inflation that or at least some contribution to the inflation that we are experiencing, and squeezing out options with respect to other spending, even before we get to having to fix the entitlement programs with both Medicare hospitalization fund and the Social Security retirement fund running out of IOUs and looking at benefit cuts, which are coming in the next 8 to 10 years. So I actually think the moment is now, where it becomes, but we don't have a leader, as you mentioned. Where it becomes impossible to ignore would be if the federal government went to the debt market and had no one willing to buy the debt at a rate we were willing to pay. And there have been some auctions that have come close to that, where there simply hadn't been the demand for debt of the federal government that had been anticipated. it's still the strongest economy. It's still considered internationally as the safest investment possible. But we are losing that, and I think the consequences are such now that if we had a leader like a Paul Ryan, that you could at least put that on the agenda. I mean, where is Ross Perot when you when you need him? Speaking of third-party candidates.
And Bob, what about unpredicted sources of problems with this? I just read today in the FT that China is going to offload a tremendous amount of very long duration treasury bills to fund some of their reinvestment in their very, very shaky real estate sectors. So to shore up their real estate sector in China, the Chinese government's going to sell a lot of US debt. Now, China has traditionally been a huge purchaser of US debt. To a large extent, the really high saving rate in China has allowed the United States to run these big deficits because we could always sell debt to the Chinese. And that figure really jumped out at me. I think it was somewhere in the range of 50 billion or something like that they were going to sell. But it really jumped out at me to think, well, what if the Chinese run into such dire straits? It's got nothing to do with America, but completely unexpectedly, China or some other big creditor nation all of a sudden needs cash and they start selling treasury bonds. And not only do they not buy more from America, but sell more. They're selling treasury bonds on the open market. Seems like that could be a potential source of real problems if we're running such huge deficits.
I think you're absolutely correct, and it would rebound into our banking system because if people are dumping federal debt instruments, it's going to reduce the price of them, which reduces the capital that our banks can show on paper. Mm-hmm. So that could be a large consequence. I don't know that the Chinese will dump enough to have that effect, but there are consequences to fiscal irresponsibility, and I think they are beginning to bite in a way that 2 or 3 years ago, when it seemed as though we could borrow any amount of money at very low interest rates, those days are gone.
You know, Bob Woodward wrote a great book during the Clinton administration, who had the last balanced budget. He actually had a surplus. But Bob Woodward's book, it was really instrumental in trying to understand what happened, how that budget actually became balanced. One of the scenes that he talks about was the Fed chairman, who was it? Not
Alan Greenspan.
Alan Greenspan, thank you. That Alan Greenspan goes in to meet with him, and the president talks about all these great stimulus programs that he's going to do and how he's going to get the economy going and how he's going to make different things happen. And Alan Greenspan sitting there nodding his head yes at him. And then when they get down to the end of the meeting, he said, well, Alan, you haven't said anything. He says, what's your thing? He goes, well, he says, Mr. President, those are all your prerogative. He goes, those sound like great ideas. You ought to go do them. And he says, I'm just going to raise interest rates because obviously you're going to be overheating the economy. And they said that Clinton said that when Alan Greenspan walked out of the room, he said, God damn it, that guy's got my reelection in his hip pocket. But that has been the value to an independent Fed in the past. I think the independent Fed, I'm fairly certain that would not work with Donald Trump. It would be the least effective thing you could do. But with most reasonable people who would recognize, gosh, raising interest rates is the same thing as taxing the public, and instead of it going into the Treasury, it's going into outside commercial sources, that's the worst way for them to be able to manage the economy. So it's a threat that's effective. It's a threat that can make them begin to think about how to balance the budget.
Well, my own view is that the Fed has contributed to our current economic predicament, that we have had artificially depressed interest rates for 2 decades. And that led to the asset bubbles, particularly in housing, that caused a lot of our economic difficulties. And in reality, the interest rates today, which are regarded as high, are historically the norm. We do not have historically high interest rates. We have pretty much the norm, and they seem high because we had 20 years of artificially depressed interest rates. So I think that you had a combination of excessive monetary stimulus and excessive fiscal stimulus that have combined to create the inflation that we experienced. And while the Fed has been unwinding some of that, both with selling off assets on its balance sheet and raising interest rates, and have reduced the peak substantially, but it appears that we have pretty sticky inflation at about 3%. And that's very bad for the future of the economy. In my view, the Fed has been part of our current economic problems because it has artificially depressed interest rates for over 2 decades. And that created asset bubbles, which were particularly in the housing industry, which was a substantial part of some of our recent economic troubles. And I think we've had a combination of excessive monetary stimulus and fiscal stimulus, which together created the out of control inflation that we had recently, rising as high as 9%. Now the Fed has responded by selling off assets that it had acquired and by raising interest rates. But it does seem that we have kind of persistent and sticky inflation at 3%, which is not healthy for our long-term economic growth. And it doesn't appear that what the Fed is currently doing is reducing it beyond that sticky point. We've been there for several months now. And we're constantly told to expect it to get better the next month, and it's just not. So I'm not sure. The Fed has kind of said, we're done. We're waiting to see when we can cut rates again, even though our current level of interest rates are pretty much at the historical norm. They are not high by historical standards. They're just high by the artificially reduced interest rates that we've experienced over the last couple decades.
So what I see that is interesting politically on this issue, excuse me, today about 49% of the public are identifying themselves as being independent or unaffiliated voters. Now, that doesn't mean they're all registered that way. In Arizona, it's about a little over a third of the voters are actually registered as an unaffiliated voter, an independent voter, but they're identifying that way. When you try to figure out how these voters connect to one another, it's really an oddity because about a third of them are on the right side, a third of them are on the left side, about a third of them are actually in the middle. They cross over on issues. But there are a couple of issues where you begin to find themes that work with them. So as an example, Democrats, people who are independents or unaffiliated that are on the left are still big supporters of civil rights, equal rights, and human rights. However, they support a balanced budget. They're not interested in a big, huge expanse of the federal government. It's not their driver. They want to make certain that there's a fairness, but fairness not defined by how much money we can give away to people. Instead, fairness making certain that people have an equal chance to be able to participate. And on the other hand, you'll see people on the right who are very pro-military and very pro-defense, but they rank the issue of the budget and the economy higher. And that's part of what you're seeing with the electorate that I see is that, you may have an independent who's pro-choice or pro-life. If you're pro-choice and that's your number one priority, you can pretty much bet you're registered as a Democrat. If you're pro-life and that's your number one priority, you can almost bet you're registered as a Republican. If you're pro-choice or pro-life, but you move the economy to being above that, you're probably an independent.
Come back to our topic that we talked about at the very start, which is Biden's plans for more really high levels of federal spending. And the question is, after this experience we've had since the pandemic of historically unprecedented levels of government spending and inflation, are people going to accept more of the same? It's a big bet, to come back to Bob's point. I think it's a big bet, and I think a lot of these concerns about the deficit that may have been not primary for people for a long time, I think that the high interest rates and high inflation may have brought them to the fore of people's minds.
Yeah, my own personal opinion is it's a great talking point because it helps engage his Democratic base, but it's not really the driver for him to be able to be successful. I think it was a way for him to prop himself up. Now, if you ask the question, do I think the public's going to buy it? Meaning the vast majority of Americans, not even close. I think when you get to saying, where is the general public? Again, they want fairness. I think you'll find most Americans think that there should be some level of fairness, but they're not looking for a bigger government as a means to be able to do that. They're not looking for a new great society. So let's go to Israel. The president spoke about Israel in the issue, and there was, you could argue that he was just trying to be fair to both sides, or that he was trying to play to both sides, but he definitely gave some discussion where he spoke about what was going on with Gaza and what's going on with Israel. What's your take on that? Is your take on that he was really trying to address more of what's going on from a foreign policy standpoint, or was this, again, more of a political speech?
My answer would be yes.
Yes.
It was a combination of both. I do believe that Biden has a passionately held view about what is happening in Gaza. But I think by trying to micromanage it, he is cutting against the grain of what is in the U.S. self-interest. I do not think it is in the self-interest of the United States, nor Israel, for the United States to be held accountable by others or to seek to be accountable in micromanaging Israel's response to the horrific attacks that it experienced at the hands of Hamas. It's a heartbreaking and difficult and complex issue. The decision by the Israeli government, which was much more broadly accepted than just the Netanyahu right-wing segment of the government, to make the objective of the war the elimination of Hamas as a force. Because of the way Hamas has aligned itself within Gaza, would necessitate very wide-scale civilian casualties. I think that has a consequence for Israel generations hence. I think it is creating extraordinary bitterness that will long survive. But evaluating that from a strategic standpoint is, to me, up to the Israelis. It's not the business of the United States to be telling them how to evaluate that trade-off. But Biden, and I think because he passionately believes it, has put himself in the pivot with respect to what happens there. And I do believe that it's in part political maneuvering, from what we discussed earlier about the problems he has with American Muslims in strategic swing states, and what's happening on college campuses and among young people whose vote he depends upon. So I think there's some political calculation, but I think it's mostly a passionate belief and getting the United States in a position that it ought not to allow itself to be put into.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you on the importance of separating between the foreign policy and the domestic policy. On the foreign policy, I'm a believer. We need to have a big deterrence. The Irans of the world need to know that they need to be cautious when they're reacting to us in terms of what we would do to respond. On the other hand, if we've learned anything, we should know that the more that we get drug into those Middle East squabbles, the more that we, especially when we decide that we're going to get involved in regime change or we're going to be the ones trying to play a long-term game, we're not very good at that. We're just not. Our public does not have the temperament for it. So as challenging as it is, from the U.S.'s standpoint, strategically in our interest, it's in our best interest to let Israel make this decision. And it's a hard decision. It just is a hard decision in terms of what they're facing. But I think what's going on domestically, there was a really good book I read last weekend. I think it's called The Identity Trap. I really recommend it if you guys get a chance to read it. But one of the social scientists that's fascinating, I don't know if any of you remember, I think his name's Edward Said, he wrote the book called Orientalism. And the whole book of Orientalism, and Henry, I'd love to hear your comment on this, but it was based upon this idea. He took Foucault's idea that said that there are no universal truths, and he applied them to this East versus West divide. He said that the West has this hierarchy of standards, and that we believe that there's some hierarchy that you're getting to with a more free society, and that we've tried to impose that upon the East in what he called Orientalism. Now, he was from Palestine, and in his book, he talks about the Middle East as well as East Africa and other places where colonialism had taken place. And the whole concept was that their standards were every bit, and their values were every bit as valid as the Western values, but that we didn't respect it. Again, we thought that there was some hierarchy. Now, what's not lost on me is, to me, I think about this idea that that there are places in the world, including in Gaza, where if a wife gets out of line, you're supposed to beat her. It's not that you should beat her or can beat her. You're supposed to beat her. If your daughter ends up being raped, the whole idea of an honor killing makes sense. There are some values that are better than other values. It's just that simple. And to me, that means there are universal values. There are things that we should be ascribing to. Maybe that's an East versus West concept, but to me, it is equally as valid and equally as real. Somehow or another, we've gotten the left and feminists, especially amongst young people, totally being willing to bypass that issue and saying, well, what's happening in Palestine, it's just a different culture. What's happening in Gaza, it's just a different culture, without really looking at it and saying, no, maybe they actually have some values that are some really bad values. And if they have values that are bad values, maybe that's part of the reason why this problem continues to fester and continue to get worse, because they just simply don't value human life and human dignity the same way that Westerners do.
Well, I think that Biden is setting himself up for a fall in the Israel-Gaza conflict for two reasons. The first is that, as Bob described, he's allowing the United States to be more directly dragged into this conflict. So on the one hand, recently he announced they're going to set up a floating platform off of Gaza and starts putting supplies onto the beach directly, which the United States has not been doing up till now. It's been leaving the transfer of humanitarian aid up to Egyptian and Israeli officials. So that's what they're doing. And on the other hand, he's also said that the Israelis should not attack this city in southern Gaza, Rafah. And I do think that the Israelis are going to attack that city to pursue this goal, as Bob said, of eliminating Hamas. So I think that Biden is setting himself up for America getting more involved, but not actually having control over the situation, right? He's drawing what he calls a red line. I saw a direct quote that this attacking the city is a red line. So I think that's setting himself up for a fall. He's calling on Israel to do something they just won't do. That's going to outrage his base. But on the other hand, for a really simple reason, I think that him calling this a red line is not a good idea, because it just recalls President Obama's declaration of the red line in Syria, that they shouldn't use chemical weapons, which they then did with impunity. And in fact, the consequence of the Syrians using chemical weapons was that America invited Russia into the Middle East, into Syria, to try and remove those weapons. So I think that Biden, as you said, Bob, I personally think it's because of these problematic constituencies. Muslim population in Michigan and to a certain extent in central Minneapolis, and then the left-wing groups on college campuses. I think that's why he feels that he has to do more, but I don't think it's going to help, because those groups are just going to be outraged even more when he promises that this is a red line that the Israelis shouldn't cross, but they do because they were going to anyway. I think that this is going to end badly for the Biden administration.
I think that's very perceptive.
So I went to Israel about a month ago or 2 months ago, but about 8 months before that, I went to Bosnia. And in Bosnia, one of my very good friends, General Wesley Clark, was the Supreme Allied Commander at the time, so I've listened to him tell stories. But I had a great chance to meet with the Muslim community there. The Muslim community, the Bosnians, were invaded by Serbia when Yugoslavia fell apart, when Tito died. And what was fascinating to me is to recognize how closely aligned the Bosnians and the Israelis are. Both of them suffered harsh Holocaust-type environments. They were slated for extinction by a group of people. And both of them ended up having a foe that was a pretty dramatic foe. Now, Israel, if you speak to someone from Israel, they would never tell you they're a victim. They'll tell you they're a survivor. And that's exactly what you'd see in Bosnia. But what's interesting is if you speak to Serbians or if you speak to Gazans, they both will defend what their government's done by denying it. Now, if you speak to a Gazan today and say what happened on October 7th was that there were young women being raped and that literally Hamas soldiers were putting the ends of their semi-automatic weapons in orifices and killing them. And when you go through that, there's just denial. And the same thing happens with Serbians. There's a massive denial that it happened. In both cases, they see themselves as victims. In both cases, they see that the other side was an oppressor, that the other side is their oppressor, and there's no room for them to be able to react. And so they end up buying into a more extreme type of government as a means of revenge. You know, when I watch this and see that it's happening and then recognize that in the United States, we at least have a difficult time even understanding the complexity, even standing back and saying, hey, did Israel have a right to defend itself? I can't help but ask why. Now, I'm going to go back to this book that I was speaking about a moment ago. I like the name. It was called The Identity Trap. And here's why I like the name. It's almost geared towards people like me. If you say to me, The Identity Trap is geared towards me. If you say to me, well, look, we ought to just make certain that race is an important issue and that we're all going to center on it, that we're going to focus on that being important. I kind of agree. I worry about people being discriminated against. If you talk to me about any individual being put into an isolated position, it's something that emotionally I connect to. I connect to those concepts of civil rights, equal rights, and human rights. But the reason it's a trap is because when you get deep enough into the philosophy, you recognize it has nothing to do with civil rights. In fact, if you go to Bell, which was the guy in the United States that began to have an effect on the process, it reversed it. His comments were he actually was a civil rights lawyer. He wanted to be a civil rights lawyer. He wanted to make that his major cause, but he kind of missed it. Most of the civil rights issues happened in the 60s. He took over in the 70s. And he actually began to agree with the far radical racist. He said, no, we were wrong on, what was it, Brown versus the Board of Education decision. He said, we should have separate and equal. We shouldn't be integrated. The integration is incorrect. That's had a huge influence, that whole teaching. It didn't just stay inside the Ivy League institutions. I think he was a lawyer from Harvard University. It began to permeate not only other law schools, it began to permeate other divisions. And this thinking, which is very, very anti-civil rights, it's very racist. I don't know how else to be able to look at it other than as being a racist strategy. But when you're lured to it saying, well, of course we should be awoken to racial issues, the answer is, well, yeah, I buy into that, I believe it. And all of a sudden you've begun to not only identify with it, but to begin to defend it. And then as you get deeper into it and find more about it, you either have to switch courses and say, actually, I didn't realize that's what it was saying. Or you have to defend it a little more and say, no, that's just an extreme group. That's just an extreme faction. I think what Biden is dealing with is 20 years of bad policy that's been going on in our universities that actually has gotten away from just being in our universities. I think our DEI thinking is all based on this exact same concept. And the challenge that it's created is, again, it's the exact opposite of being anti-racist. It is a strategy that oftentimes the people who are being trapped into it, they just simply don't understand what it is that's being advocated for.
One of the major challenges in educating the electorate, I believe, is exactly what you've touched on. People who haven't dealt with this directly or delved into it deeply believe that the DEI movement, what I call identity and grievance politics, is just an extension of the civil rights and maybe an extension that goes too far. Do not understand that it is fundamentally different, and it rejects the tenets of the original civil rights movement. When the American voter is given a choice to express him or herself directly on this issue, they universally go for treating people as individuals irrespective of race or other identifying characteristics. And you see affirmative action disguised as racial quotas be rejected on ballot after ballot, including in very liberal states such as California. But the general electorate hasn't caught up with the sharp division that you correctly described, and how this isn't a extension of civil rights. It's a rejection of the tenets of civil rights. Martin Luther King's famous statement that I want to live in a society where my 4 little children are judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin, is regarded by the identity and grievance politics crowd as a prop to hold up white supremacy. It is a rejection, as we discussed on a previous show, of the American creed of aspiring to be a meritocracy and moving increasingly in that direction and expanding opportunity to participate in the meritocracy, but being a meritocracy is the aspiration. They reject that and have sought to undermine it, and have succeeded not only in the universities, but in major corporations anymore. Mandatory training of identity and grievance politics tenets is now pretty standard fare. Now, I do believe we're getting a backlash, and intellectuals on the center left are finally stepping up and helping to combat this so that it's not just a right-wing attack among people whose commitment to civil rights in the old sense was regarded as suspect. So I think we're beginning to see, for the first time, an effective attempt to roll that back. I don't know how far it will go because, as you stated, it is extremely ingrained, and particularly, Henry, in the places that you and your colleagues haunt.
Yeah, of course, these ideologies all come from universities, whether it's Edward Said's Orientalism or critical race theory. All these theories always come from universities, whether they're from sociology departments or comparative literature departments, is where a lot of these ideologies actually came from. Law schools as well. They do seem to have taken up a huge amount of influence, but I think mostly among relative elites. And Paul, you said you wanted to talk about the Oscars, and I have a kind of a segue to talk about the Oscars, the award ceremony, because one of the implications of, or maybe extreme implications, maybe it's mischaracterization, maybe it's a misinterpretation of critical race theory, is essentially that the sufferings of some groups are privileged over those of others, right? So the sufferings of those that are considered oppressed, whether because of social class, if you're, canonical Marxist, or if you critical race theorist, the oppressed are based on their race, their sufferings are sort of privileged over those of others. And when you transpose that onto the Israel-Gaza conflict, the suffering of the Israelis at the hands of Hamas is seen as less important than the suffering of Gazans at the hands of the Israelis during the invasion of Gaza. And you actually see this in really stark form among cultural elites, like at the Oscars, where I saw some photos of actors wearing badges calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. And in fact, there have been scandals in Germany recently where the Berlin Film Festival, there were extremely critical speeches made by people accepting awards on the main stage, very critical of Israel, with absolutely no mention of the terrorist attacks by Hamas. And this has caused a huge outcry in Germany. And very similar things were happening at some very major art exhibitions in Germany as well. And so I think cultural elites have also been drawn into this kind of dichotomy between the oppressor and the oppressed, and they will also incline to have solidarity only with this one group that's seen as structurally oppressed due to class or racial issues. And they either don't mention, for example, that Israel was attacked by Hamas and all these atrocities were committed, or they're very, very dismissive of them. So, yeah, one of the more unjust, extreme forms of this ideology really can lead to this quite perverse distortion of solidarity or compassion with one group but not another. And we're seeing that, for example, last week at the Oscars.
All right, so I can't leave this victim discussion without talking about who I see as being the biggest victim of all, which is Donald Trump. I got to hit on that just at least for a moment. So, and gain your guys' opinion on this. Now,
this should be interesting.
Here's to be fair. I think these issues that we're talking about, the Me Too movement, there are many, many good redeeming values of what happened with the Me Too movement. But it's impossible to not look at that and realize that there were some victims also, and sometimes some innocent victims from that. People who were accused of something that just because they were accused, a wrongful action was taken. Now, again, I can't judge whether that was 10% of the time or 80% of the time, but it did happen. There's no doubt about that. I think a lot of people who have been through that, I know of a lot of white men who went through that, who lost their job or got demoted or didn't get the next thing that they were supposed to get. You can't help but be a mayor of Phoenix without knowing people that happened to, but it's also happened in other companies where they felt like they couldn't speak up for themselves. They felt like they couldn't talk about how they had been aggrieved. Well, it was inevitable. Somebody was going to come along, who was going to see them, who was going to say, I understand you, who's going to speak their language. And once that happened, they were going to follow him. They were going to follow him no matter what he did, no matter what he said, no matter what law he broke. So now we're in this huge discussion about, is Donald Trump a victim? Are we utilizing the legal system to go after him in an unfair way? I'd love to have your guys' input on that.
I think there are instances in the cases that have been filed against him in which that is an accurate description or at least concern. In others, not so much, and I'll sort of try to differentiate between them. The problem in terms of what appears, I think, to most people to be an excessive penalty for his financial dealings when he paid all of his debts at the agreed interest rate, and the borrowers or the lenders were big boys perfectly capable of doing their own due diligence before deciding to lend him the money. The fault lies with a New York law that does give the state power to allege sort of a harm against the general population. So I don't know that bringing that case was an abuse of power or that the judge's decision was abuse of power. There's just a very bad anti-business law on the books in New York. I think that there is reason to investigate and perhaps prosecute some of the behavior that took place by Trump and others in the attempt to overturn the outcome of the 2020 election. Certainly there were people who signed and submitted false official documents. There are laws against that. There is evidence that Trump participated in discussions about carrying out this overall conspiracy. And it's hard to interpret his discussion with the Secretary of State of Georgia as other than an attempt at intimidation, which included a threat. So I do believe that there are grounds for various prosecutors to be at least investigating and considering filing cases. Now, I've always felt that our racketeering laws are vastly too elastic and are used in instances that go far beyond the original intent of giving law enforcement some tools to use against the mob. So I think there was overcharging by filing racketeering charges in Georgia, as opposed to more narrow and specific charges. There wasn't a similar overcharging in what the special prosecutor has brought at the federal level. It is that Trump engaged in a conspiracy to prevent an official act of the U.S. government, which was the certification of the election. And there isn't in that case any accusations about the incitement of the subsequent riot. It looks at the overall behavior. Now, the classified documents case, I don't know how any prosecutor wouldn't bring at least charges about violating the subpoena. I mean, the guy was given a legal subpoena saying produce these documents, and rather than produce them, he hid them. You don't have to get to the issue of whether he should have had the documents to begin with, whether he could have declassified them, whether his behavior was distinguishable in terms of keeping the documents from that of Biden or Hillary Clinton in getting classified information on an unsecured server. But he is unique in everyone else cooperated with law enforcement. He was given a legal subpoena, and instead of producing the documents, he hid them. I don't know how any prosecutor overlooks that, irrespective of what political benefit it may have created for Trump in the Republican primary.
I don't know anywhere near as much about these legal cases as Bob does, so I'll leave the commentary to him. Eventually, they're going to be all decided by the courts. I'm not so worried about whether Trump is a victim. What I'm more worried about is the effects in the future, both whether we see some sort of tit-for-tat legal attacks on former candidates or on former incumbents, or maybe even incumbents who are in office, both at the federal and at the state level. And that could cause some sort of chilling effect where people no longer are willing to run for office if they are not comfortable with this level of legal scrutiny. That to me seems like a threat to the broader democratic institutions in the country that would be really, really worrying. So I'm less concerned about whether Donald Trump himself is a victim in any of these cases, and much more concerned about whether they are a one-off for him, or whether this type of legal attack becomes normalized in American politics, which I think would be extremely concerning.
Yeah, my view of this is I have a lot of discussions with friends who will like to tell me how unprecedented this is, how unprecedented these legal actions are. And I agree. But Donald Trump was unprecedented. There's never been anything, at least in my lifetime, like him. And I've read a lot of history, and at least in American history, there hadn't been a lot of what I've read about in history that was like him. The question is, does he share any of the blame for this? All right, that to me is the question. So, we watched the case in New York where he lost $5 million. All he had to do was shut up, and he would have only lost $5 million. Instead, it becomes 92, and who knows if there isn't another one. Now, you can blame that on the judge and the jury and other people that are there, but he wouldn't have even faced a second trial if he'd have just gone out and went back to normal campaigning. You can't do it. Right? I'm convinced of this. If you said to Donald Trump, hey, there's a guy over sitting in the White House. He's in his 80s. He looks a lot older than you. If you just act normal, you're going to win. I don't think he can do it. I don't think it is within him to do it. You look at the documents case. All he had to do was give up the documents the second time they came, the third time they came, maybe even the fourth time they came. He couldn't do it. And I don't know why. Maybe because he had some secret he had to hide, but I'll bet that's not it. I'll bet it's because he just can't do it. He just can't give it to them. I look at the case that is happening on whether or not they try to subvert the election. Good God, he has Mike Pence, who gave him every benefit of a doubt, every chance he could, who says, no, he tried to pressure me to overturn the election. Now, I don't know if that's breaking the law, but I know it isn't right. Then it's not hard for me to look at it and say, I'm no lawyer, I'm no judge. I can't make a decision on the legal issues. But is it right? It's not even close to being right. None of this is good for our system. None of it. Donald Trump wasn't good for our system, and what our system's doing to prosecute Donald Trump isn't good for our system. I don't know what the right reaction is, but I'm positive of one thing. This guy's not a victim. All right, this guy perpetuates over and over again these problems, and you can bet on this. If he wins, he's going to perpetuate a bunch more. It's just not going to stop. I am no Biden fan, and I'm going to go back to the beginning of this. If you'd asked me in listening to his speech, I was saying, oh God, please give us a third-party candidate that I can vote for, right? Because I didn't like it at all. I didn't, especially the portion that said, to get to fairness, I'm a believer in fairness, but to get to fairness, we have to vastly expand the federal government. That part bothers me the most. I liked what he had to say about foreign policy. But in looking at that dilemma, to me, again, I keep coming back to this. I've got this one guy who wants to take everything out of my pocket if he possibly can, and maybe more, because if we don't find a way to deal with this budget deficit, we may actually bankrupt the country. That worries me. But I believe as long as I have a vote, I have some pressure against them. If I lose that right to vote, I don't think I have any pressure to fight back with anything. And it's clear to me over and again, Donald Trump at least wants us to believe he's willing to take it away. He does nothing to dispel it. Even his meetings that he's having with authoritarians this week, he does nothing to dispel it. Now, maybe he's the idiot savant and he has no idea that these things that he keeps doing are signals to us that says, hey, this guy's willing to overthrow our government. I don't think so. I think he knows exactly what signals he's sending out. Last comments.
He's been a genius at developing political formulations that touched the hot button of enough people that he has transformed one of our two major political parties from Reagan-esque traditional republicanism to populist nationalism. That's now the dominant force. And it's force of his personality, and it's a genius that he has in terms of developing hot button political formulations.
Mm-hmm.
I'll finish with a question, Paul. What if Donald Trump is not unique? What if he's just the first of many? What if the next candidate on the right is not a career politician, but another reality TV show or a podcast host like Joe Rogan? What if the next candidate on the left is also not a career politician, but someone like Taylor Swift or Oprah Winfrey or any number of other media stars? And all of these people are going to behave in completely outrageous ways compared to how they are supposed to behave according to everything that we've expected. So I think that Trump has kind of exploded the envelope of what is possible in American politics. And it's completely unpredictable where we're going to go from here, but he might not be unique. He might just be the first of many in this deep, deep political realignment we're experiencing.
Well, I'll tell you what, Bob and I will both give an answer to that, but then you get the last comment. You get to say goodbye. Here's my comment to that. The first one is, I know people on the left who would be willing to do the exact same thing that he's trying to do to get his way, to get their way. They fundamentally believe that the majority is not smart enough to really understand what's in their best interest. And consequently, if they could change the system where it wasn't determined based upon a vote, but was based upon them, they would do it. I think, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are a lot alike. They both have these extreme views, and their extreme views are, to me, don't seem very democratic at all. Now, saying that, I haven't seen anything like Donald Trump in my life. Nothing. I don't think another candidate, if they tried really, really hard on the right or the left, could do what he's doing. And I think some people have tried. I think DeSantis tries. But in the end, DeSantis is like a very smart lawyer who I think at the end of the day really does care about the Constitution. He's limited. Where Donald Trump is different is there are no limits. They don't exist. There's no walls on the outside. He doesn't believe he's constrained by anything that the rest of us are constrained by. Not a constitution, not mores or norms or anything else. He's not constrained by any of them. And what I see almost from everyone else is at least some limits that keep them in the fairway.
Celebrityhood has always been a very huge political advantage. I mean, the guy that made the runoff in the California election is the former first baseman for the Los Angeles Dodgers. It's a state that's elected two movie stars, Ronald Reagan and Arnold Schwarzenegger, as governors. So it's always been an advantage politically, and I think you're correct that it's probably going to be even more of an advantage in the future. I think Trump has expanded sort of the pathways to political office among those who might aspire to it. I do believe that Trump is unusual in the political genius that we talked about being able to develop hot-button political formulations that created a cult of personality. In the past, the Republican grassroots was extremely policy-oriented. You needed to fall in line on specific policies, and if you didn't, you were in trouble. And now it is a populist personality cult. I think that as much as I depreciate Trump on all sorts of scores, I do believe he had a political genius for that we haven't seen in this country since Huey Long. So I don't know that anyone can be his successor. I do believe that he may have transformed the Republican Party on policy in very substantial ways that leaves traditional Reagan-esque conservatives sort of politically homeless right now. So that may be enduring. And it may be a wish more than analysis, Henry, but I do believe he's got a peculiar and unique political genius that run-of-the-mill political demagogues won't be able to replicate.
Run-of-the-mill demagogues. I like that. Henry, last comment.
I agree that your run-of-the-mill demagogue doesn't have the talent of Donald Trump, but I think that Donald Trump honed that political talent through media. He was a media genius, media entrepreneur, as much as he was a real estate entrepreneur. So he knew America. He knew middle America. He was selling advertisements to them for his TV shows for years. He knew what they wanted. He knew their tastes. And that's why I keep bringing up the potential for another media personality to explode onto the American political scene. If things are so polarized, if people are so disaffected with the current two candidates, maybe someone like that could cut through really fast, and not just because of their fame, but also because in some ways they might know America better than their politicians do. So I think that Trump is definitely unique up to this point, but he might not be unique going forward.
Well, if we have to have another media person, let's hope it's an optimist this time. Guys, thanks very much for being with us. We'll see you guys next week.
Great. Thank you, Paul.
And we stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of unknown opportunities and perils. It holds out the promise of more sacrifice instead of more security. The new frontier is here.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.